It was the 16th of May, 1992, a warm Saturday evening that carried the scent of cut grass and fresh rain on warm pavement. In Harlow County, Ohio, the entire town seemed to hold its breath around one building that night. It was prom night, the last real exhale of childhood before graduation sent everyone tumbling into the rest of their lives. Inside the Crestwood Banquet Hall, colored lights bounced off the ceiling tiles, and the air was thick with body spray, hairspray, and the kind of joy that only teenagers who don't yet know what losses can feel. Daniel Carver, 18, wasn't the type to be found in the middle of the dance floor. He was the kind of kid who stood near the edges and laughed loudest from the side. That night, though, he looked different. His navy tuxedo sat perfectly on his shoulders, his dark hair combed back the way his mother had asked him to, and there was a lightness in his step that felt earned. Across the room, his best friend since third grade, Tommy Reyes, was making faces at him from behind a punch bowl, doing an exaggerated slow dance with an imaginary partner just to make him laugh. And beside him, Claire Anderson, quiet and sharp-eyed, wearing a pale blue dress and a thin gold bracelet she had borrowed from her aunt, pressed her lips together, trying not to spit her drink out. The three of them had grown up like family. Same neighborhood, same lunch table, same back corner booth at Sparky's Diner every weekend since 8th grade. They had studied for the same finals, survived the same gym teachers, and talked about their futures so many times that the conversations had become a kind of ritual. That night, standing under the spinning lights of the Crestwood Hall, the future felt like something just around a corner they were finally allowed to see. Around 11:45 in the evening, the three said their goodbyes, waving to clusters of classmates still drifting around the parking lot. Daniel pulled out his keys and made a joke about being the official driver of questionable ideas. Claire rolled her eyes. Tommy called shotgun before anyone asked. They climbed into Daniel's silver '89 Pontiac Grand Prix, a hand-me-down from his uncle that he kept cleaner than most adults kept their own cars. Their plan was nothing elaborate. Drive out to Greystone Overlook, a clearing above Ridgeline Lake where you could see the whole valley, take a few photos, listen to a mixtape Tommy had made, and be home before curfew. Simple. Easy. The kind of night that never makes the news. They never came back. By the next morning, their families figured they had fallen asleep at someone's house. It was graduation season, after all. Teenagers stayed out. They overslept. They forgot to call. By noon, though, when none of them had answered their phones, when none of them had appeared for the afternoon shifts they each had at separate jobs, the reassurances started to hollow out. Daniel's mother called the Reyes household. Tommy's parents called the Andersons. Nobody knew anything. Nobody had seen them since the parking lot. By Sunday evening, the police were called. The first officers on the scene were measured in their concern. This happened every year, they explained carefully. Prom weekends brought out the restless streak in teenagers. There was always a story of 3 or 4 kids who vanished for a few days before turning up sunburned and sheepish. Give it until Monday, one of them said, with the practiced calm of someone who had learned not to assume the worst too quickly. But Monday came, and with it came the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like something wrong. By Monday morning, the search was already underway. Volunteer crews walked the back roads that connected the Crestwood Hall to the lake. Patrol units were dispatched down old service paths and fire roads that cut through the county's rural edges. Bloodhounds were brought in, given the kids' jackets from their lockers, and pressed into the tree lines. Helicopters swept low over the farmland, their lights dragging across cornfields and drainage ditches and the dark glass surface of Ridgeline Lake. Nothing. Not a single skid mark. Not a dropped piece of clothing. Not a scratch of silver paint on a guardrail. The Pontiac had vanished so cleanly, it was as if it had simply ceased to exist somewhere between the parking lot and the Overlook Road. The families refused to sit still. Daniel's father drove his old work truck back and forth along Route 41, stopping every few hundred yards to get out and look into the ditch. Tommy's older sister papered every truck stop and rest area between Harlow County and the state line with flyers. Claire's mother sat beside the kitchen phone with a yellow legal pad, writing down every tip that came in, no matter how strange, no matter how thin. A young woman seen at a roadside diner matching Claire's description. A car that sounded like it might be silver-spotted near the river. A rumor about a party in a field outside county limits. Each one was chased, and each one collapsed. By the end of the first week, the candles came out. St. Michael's Church, on the older end of Main Street, opened its doors for a community vigil. The pews filled quickly. 3 senior portraits were placed at the front of the altar, framed in simple wood, each face smiling with the particular ease of someone who had no reason not to. Local reporters stood along the outer walls, cameras clicking softly. The families sat in the front row, and for the first time in days, they let themselves cry without having to be strong for the next phone call. Investigators spread their maps flat on conference room tables and started over, route by route, creek by creek. The path from the banquet hall to the overlook was short, barely 8 miles of rural road. But there were side roads, access points, stretches where the tree line crowded close to the shoulder and the pavement turned to gravel before ending entirely. They were certain something had been missed, but every inch they covered gave them nothing new to work with. By the second week, the word missing had started to feel permanent. The search radius widened, pulling in neighboring counties and eventually drawing attention from the state level. The car became the central point of every press release. 2-door coupe, metallic silver, license plate reading 4 Golf 2971. It was described on every local radio station, printed in every newspaper, mentioned in every evening broadcast from Columbus to Cleveland. Not one confirmed sighting came back. It was as though the car had been swallowed whole by the county road itself. Helicopters continued to pass over the area for weeks that summer, scanning quarry ponds and the shallower sections of the lake where teens were known to gather at night. Divers were sent into the murky water along the lake's eastern shore, dragging the floor with equipment that could detect metal and glass below visibility. Officers probed old drainage systems, collapsed barn foundations, and abandoned grain silos that dotted the farmland east of the highway. Each time, the search teams returned with nothing but mud on their boots and the weight of another dead end. Meanwhile, the rumors inside town became their own storm. At the breakfast counter of Sparky's Diner, someone claimed that Claire's ex-boyfriend had shown up to prom that night looking for a confrontation. Another story spread at the gas station that a group of older teenagers had been overheard saying there had been a crash and someone with connections in the county had helped make it disappear. There were whispers of a plan, that the 3 had staged it all and were somewhere in another state living under new names. Grief does strange things to communities. It fills silence with anything, no matter how unlikely, just to give the silence some shape. Detectives followed every lead with the same diligence. They sat across from classmates who had danced beside the trio only hours before everything stopped. They interviewed the catering staff from the banquet hall, the attendant at the gas station where Daniel had stopped to fill the tank around 10:15 that evening, the parking lot attendant who remembered seeing 3 kids laughing as they walked toward a silver car. Each interview painted the same picture up until the same point, and then the picture ended. No one saw them leave the parking lot. No one saw the car turn onto the highway. Beyond the edge of the Crestwood property, the 3 simply didn't exist anymore. The families kept organizing even as official momentum slowed. Through June and July, volunteer search parties woke before dawn and fanned out across the landscape with ropes tied to their belts and photos printed on laminated cards. Flyers appeared everywhere, at the laundromat and the grocery store, at the highway rest area and the county fairgrounds. The 3 faces, printed in slightly grainy black and white from yearbook negatives, looked out from bulletin boards and telephone poles across the length of Harlow County. At St. Michael's, a small table near the entrance was set up with candles and a guest book. Long after official attention faded, people kept stopping by. Some left flowers. Some left notes. Some just stood quietly for a minute and then left. Daniel's mother came every Sunday before the service started, arriving in the dark to relight whatever candles had burned down overnight. Tommy's father, a tall and ordinarily loud man who filled rooms with his laugh, sat in the back pew each week and never once raised his eyes from the floor. Claire's mother, Margaret, refused to touch anything in Claire's bedroom. The dress she had worn shopping for was still hanging on the door of the closet, tissue paper still folded around the collar. The calendar on her desk still showed May 1992. It stayed that way. The investigation continued, at least officially. New sightings came in from neighboring states. A girl in Kentucky at a roadside motel. A car matching the Grand Prix pulled over on an Indiana highway. A note left at a gas station with no fingerprints and no useful information. Each one was logged, followed, and filed away when it came to nothing. The sheriff's department kept the case active through the fall, But as winter approached, the pace slowed to the pace of paperwork rather than investigation. Patrols stopped running the back roads each evening. The volunteer coordination dissolved. The search fund ran dry. By the time the lake froze over that December, the case had begun its long, quiet slide toward folklore. Kids in Harlow County started telling the story the way teenagers tell ghost stories, part true, part exaggerated, entirely used to explain what could not otherwise be explained. They said you could see headlights at night floating over the surface of Ridgeline Lake, moving slow and purposeless like they were looking for something. They said if you parked near the overlook and turned your engine off, you could sometimes hear music, low and fading, like a tape playing in a car moving away from you. For the parents, those stories were a particular kind of cruelty. For the teenagers who told them, it was the only language available for a wound the town didn't know how to dress. In early 1993, a new detective was assigned to the file. His name was Carl Morrow, and he was younger than most of the officers who had worked the original search. He read everything twice: the grid maps, the soil sample reports, the aerial photographs taken during the summer sweeps, the typed transcripts of every witness interview. He found most of it thorough and most of it empty. But something in the background of one photograph caught his eye. In the distance, just visible through the tree line east of the highway, was a construction zone. A flat stretch of ground with fresh gravel and equipment sitting idle under a tarp. It was the Dry Creek industrial property. In the summer of 1992, it had been nothing more than a lot under development, a future warehouse site sitting between a gravel company and a truck storage yard. By the time Morrow noticed it in the photographs, the first structures had already been framed and the foundation work was mostly finished. He jotted the observation in his notepad. He meant to follow up. He never did. There was nothing obvious to connect it to 3 missing teenagers, and the idea that something had been poured over felt like a thought that only made sense in fiction. The last flyers came down before summer. The billboards along Route 41 were replaced by seasonal advertising. The high school graduated its class of '93, and in the gymnasium, where Daniel and Tommy and Claire had spent years playing basketball and shuffling through mandatory assemblies, the graduating seniors left 3 seats empty in the front row. A bundle of white lilies lay across the chairs. The ceremony ended and the audience filtered into the parking lot, blinking in the afternoon sun, not quite sure what to say. Life moved the way life moves, which is to say it kept going whether anyone was ready for it. Tommy's mother refused to sell his truck, a 1986 pickup with a cracked side mirror and a bumper sticker from a trip they had taken to Cedar Point. She parked it under the oak tree in the side yard and started it twice a month just to keep the battery from dying. Daniel's younger brother, Nathan, joined the military 2 years after the disappearance. Every time he came home on leave, he drove the roads between the banquet hall and the lake in the hours after midnight, certain he was seeing something the search teams had been too tired or too rushed to catch. He never found anything. He kept driving anyway. Claire's father, who had spent the first year being the loudest voice demanding answers from the sheriff's department, went quiet before the second year was out. His house fell into a kind of gentle neglect. The gutters filled with leaves and stayed filled. The front porch light was left on all the time, even in summer, even at noon. When neighbors asked, he said he just wanted to make sure she could find her way back. By the end of 1993, the case was officially reclassified. It moved from active investigation to cold case, transferred in a cardboard box to a back room of the sheriff's building where files went when no one knew what else to do with them. Over the following years, new officers rotated through the department. The detectives who had spent that summer in the field moved on to other cases, other counties, retirement, or grief of their own. A few remembered to pull the box around the anniversary. Most didn't. The years moved the way years move when loss is unresolved. They accumulated without resolving anything. By the late 90s, the Prom vanishing, as it had come to be called in the county, had completed the full transformation from tragedy to cautionary tale. Parents told the story to their teenagers the way parents tell the kinds of stories designed to make night driving feel less casual. Older siblings described the 3 missing seniors to younger ones the way they might describe a warning carved into a tree. Every year on the 16th of May, the same small group gathered at the church to relight the same candles and read the same names. Fewer people came as the years stacked up, but the parents always came. Some things don't thin with time. They just get quieter. In 2001, a retired officer named Gerald Paone decided to take one more look. Paone had been a patrol deputy during the original search, barely 2 years on the job, tasked with running flyers to neighboring jurisdictions and manning the tip line. The case had followed him the way some cases follow certain people, not loudly, just always there. Now retired and with nothing but time, he began pulling old documents from the county archive. A tip came to him through a contact at a local construction company. A man who had done gravel work in the area during the early 90s mentioned an access road that didn't appear on any current county map. It had run behind the old quarry, cutting across a parcel of land that was later developed and paved. The man described it as a dead-end slope, steep at the bottom with loose fill soil, the kind of soft ground that shifted unpredictably after rain. Paone wrote everything down and drove out to see the area for himself. In August of that year, he and a pair of off-duty deputies borrowed a ground-penetrating radar unit and spent a weekend walking a grid across the overgrown land at the edge of the Dry Creek development. The scanner produced a printout of soil density and anomalies below the surface. There were a few pockets of interest, but when they dug by hand into the most promising one, they found compressed fill and nothing else. The cadaver dog they had borrowed from the county brought in for a second sweep circled the perimeter twice and sat down, unmoved. Paone drove home that Sunday evening and wrote up his findings in 3 paragraphs. He mailed a copy to the cold case file, a copy to the sheriff's department, and kept one for himself. In an interview with a regional paper weeks later, he said something that stayed with people who read it. He said he felt certain the answer was within a mile of where he had been standing. He just couldn't say which direction. No funding came for further work. No official follow-up was scheduled. The box in the back room of the sheriff's department got another sheet of paper added to the stack inside it. Claire's mother, Margaret, had not slowed down. If anything, the years had focused her. In 2002, she organized a small campaign she called Remember the Three, printing materials out of her kitchen, mailing them to missing persons organizations, and calling regional radio stations until someone agreed to let her speak. She appeared on 3 separate programs that year, always with a framed photograph of her daughter on the table beside her, always with the same quiet certainty in her voice that made people understand she had not moved into grief. She had moved through it and come out the other side, holding something harder. On air, she was controlled. At home, her friends said she had become the case. That was the word they used. She had become it. Nathan Carver, Daniel's brother, took a different route. In 2003, he joined the Harlow County Sheriff's Department as a deputy. He didn't make a public statement about why. His colleagues could see it plainly enough. He requested access to the cold case folder every few months, reviewing the maps in the break room after late shifts with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. When calls came in about unidentified vehicles pulled from rivers, or when license plates turned up in salvage records that needed verification, Nathan was the first to volunteer. Every single time, the answer came back the same. Not the Grand Prix. Not Daniel. Not anyone they were looking for. The county changed around the families without asking their permission. Route 41 was widened and remarked. The Overlook Road was gated off after a property dispute and never reopened. The Crestwood Banquet Hall closed in 2004, sat vacant for 2 years, then was demolished for a hardware supply store. The high school renovated its hallways in 2008, and the memorial display that had held the 3 framed photos was dismantled during construction. Someone packed the photos into a box and left them in the main office. They sat there until a secretary put them back up near the library entrance on her own initiative. By 2010, the only people who still reliably brought up the case were those who had been personally touched by it. Journalists ran retrospective pieces on round-numbered anniversaries, usually 5 paragraphs and a photo, then moved on. The families gave those interviews with the practiced patience of people who had learned that being heard and being helped were not the same thing. Claire's father passed away in 2012, still sleeping across the hall from his daughter's unchanged room. Margaret continued living in the house alone, the room preserved behind a closed door that smelled faintly of perfume and old carpet. Nathan, now a seasoned officer with 12 years on the force, gave a brief interview to a regional outlet in which he said something that got reprinted more widely than he expected. He said he no longer believed they would find the 3 of them alive. He said at this point, all he wanted was to bring his brother home. That quiet sentence ran in papers from Columbus to Cincinnati. It reignited the story for a few weeks, brought in a handful of fresh tips, and then faded again the way all things faded in a case that had been fading for over 2 decades. But the sentence was also the last thing anyone remembered hearing before the ground gave up what it had been keeping. In the summer of 2016, a development company broke ground on the old Dry Creek industrial parcel. The property had changed hands several times over the years and was being cleared for a commercial shipping facility. The crews working the site that July were doing what crews always do, tearing up old foundation slabs, pulling rebar, leveling uneven ground in preparation for new concrete. On a Wednesday morning, around 10:45, an equipment operator named Raymond Walsh felt his machine stop dead on a section of slab near the eastern edge of the lot. He reversed the bucket, repositioned, and pushed forward again. The machine shuddered. The sound coming up from below was wrong. Not rebar, not pipe, solid and curved, like something with a deliberate shape. Walsh climbed down and waved over the site foreman. They started pulling debris away by hand, chipping at the crumbling edge of the old slab until something gleamed beneath the broken concrete. It caught the morning light the way painted metal catches it, dully and with the faintest recognition. Walsh brushed a line of dust off the surface with his forearm. Beneath his hand was a roofline, sloped, curved where it met what was clearly a windshield frame. He stepped back. The foreman picked up his radio. Sheriff's deputies arrived within the hour. The site was cordoned, all equipment powered down, and a forensic excavation team was called in from the county seat. Over the next several hours, the machines worked carefully around the edges of the buried structure, removing the concrete layer by layer until the shape beneath was undeniable. It was a two-door coupe, fully intact beneath its cocoon of hardened cement. The body panels were crushed in places from the weight of the poured material, but the overall form was unmistakable. A car, lowered into an open pit sometime in the early 90s, before the foundation had been completed above it. The VIN plate, partially corroded but still legible, was photographed and run through the system before sunset. The officer who got the result read it twice, then a third time, and then walked over to where the site supervisor was standing and said nothing for a long moment before reading it aloud. The number matched a 1989 Pontiac Grand Prix, registered to Daniel Carver. Last seen in the parking lot of the Crestwood Banquet Hall on the evening of May 16, 1992. 24 years, 2 months, and a few days earlier. By nightfall, the lot was ringed with news vans. The glow of portable floodlights made the scene look like a film set. Deputies stood along the tape perimeter while investigators in protective gear worked slowly through the interior of the unearthed vehicle. The doors were carefully removed rather than opened. The roof was peeled back in sections. Inside, the forensic team found what they had gone looking for without daring to say it aloud. 3 sets of human remains, each where a passenger would have been seated 24 years ago. In the driver's seat, decomposed fragments of a tuxedo jacket, its buttons still fastened. On the passenger side floor, a thin gold bracelet, its clasp intact, engraved with 2 letters. CA. In the back seat, a class ring, crusted with time and corrosion, but readable along the inner band. Tommy Reyes. Lincoln High, class of 92. Scattered near the center console, the broken plastic shell of a cassette tape, its ribbon spooled loose, the kind of tape teenagers made for car trips, and labeled by hand. The forensic team bagged each item with the careful deliberateness of people who understood what they were holding. That night, the sheriff of Harlow County stood at a podium outside the tape perimeter and read a short statement. His voice was steady, but his face was not. He confirmed that the vehicle recovered from the Dry Creek industrial site was consistent with the one reported missing in 1992. He confirmed the presence of 3 sets of human remains inside. He said DNA confirmation was pending, but that the department was treating the discovery with the gravity it deserved. Behind the barricade to his left, 3 families stood together, the way they had stood together at every vigil for 24 years. They did not speak to reporters that night. There was nothing that could be said that the silence hadn't already said better. In the days that followed, the questions multiplied faster than the answers. The vehicle had been found less than 1.5 miles from the Crestwood Banquet Hall. The industrial parcel where it was buried had been under development in the summer of 1992, with foundation work completed in June of 1993. 13 months after the disappearance. If the car had simply fallen into an open construction pit and been accidentally sealed under poured concrete, why had no worker ever reported it? Why had no pre-pour inspection flagged the presence of a large metallic object in the foundation bed? Why were there no impact marks on the body panels consistent with a fall? Forensic engineers studied the undercarriage. What they found was not what an accident would have produced. The frame showed no evidence of high-velocity collision. The axles were intact. There were no stress fractures in the body panels that would indicate a rolling impact or a fall from a significant height. The positioning of the vehicle inside the pit was level and deliberate, consistent with being lowered rather than dropped. The gear shift was in neutral. The keys were still in the ignition. The seat belts were unbuckled. Detectives pulled the land records for the Dry Creek parcel and traced the ownership and contracting history back to the early 90s. The foundation slab that had covered the vehicle was linked to a job performed by a company called Pendleton and Associates, a small industrial contractor that had done steady work across the county between 1991 and 1994 before dissolving under the weight of fraud charges. The owner, a man named Gerald Foss, had fled the state in the summer of 1994, leaving behind a string of employee disputes and at least 2 pending civil suits. A retired foreman named Dennis Birch, who had worked for Pendleton during those years and now lived outside Knoxville, was tracked down by phone. He answered on the third call. When investigators described what had been found at the Dry Creek site, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he remembered that job. He described a pour that had happened over a single weekend, off schedule and unplanned, ordered directly by Foss and not listed in the standard work log. The crew had been told to arrive late on a Friday evening and finish before Saturday noon. When they arrived, Foss was already at the site with a second man Birch didn't recognize and hadn't seen before or since. The two of them had kept the crew away from the eastern section of the lot until the foundation bed was ready. When Birch walked that section the following morning before the concrete truck arrived, the bed appeared to have been freshly disturbed, the fill loose and recently turned. He had not asked questions. He had been paid in cash for the weekend. He had told himself the unusual fill was something structural, maybe piping, maybe an equipment pit. He had not let himself think otherwise. For 23 years, he had not let himself think otherwise. That single account shifted the investigation from reconstruction to criminality. Search warrants were filed. The remaining paper records of Pendleton and Associates were subpoenaed from the state archive. Forensic accountants began combing through what little financial documentation still existed. Within weeks, investigators had identified Gerald Foss at a residence in rural Louisiana, where he had been living quietly under a name that was one letter off from his legal one. He was 71 years old. He had a condition involving his heart. He answered the door himself when 2 investigators knocked. He did not appear surprised to see them. He admitted to having worked the Dry Creek site. He denied any knowledge of a vehicle being present in the foundation bed. He said the overnight pour had been ordered by a property contact he could no longer name, and that he had simply followed the schedule he was given. When inconsistencies in his statements were pointed out, he adjusted his account rather than correcting it. When asked to take a polygraph examination, he agreed immediately. He failed the first question. The physiological responses noted in the report were described by the examiner as highly consistent with deception. Investigators were building toward formal charges, obstruction at minimum, accessory after the fact as a possibility, when Foss's health began to deteriorate rapidly. He suffered a significant cardiac event less than 5 months after the interview. He was hospitalized, treated, and sent home, where he died 4 weeks later in his own bed. No indictment had been filed. No formal charge had been made. The man who had poured concrete over 3 teenagers on a June evening in 1993 went to his grave, having said nothing useful. For the families, it was almost too familiar. The pattern they had lived with for decades, getting close and then watching the answer fold away just before it could be reached, repeated itself one final time in the worst possible way. Nathan Carver, standing in the parking lot of the department the evening he heard about Foss's death, reportedly said nothing to anyone for a long time. A colleague found him sitting in his patrol car with the engine off. When asked if he was all right, he said, "Somebody knew. He didn't do this alone." He was not wrong to think so. Among the documents recovered from the state archive was a county inspection certificate, signed and dated in July of 1993, approving the Dry Creek slab as structurally complete and up to code. The inspector who had signed it was a mid-level county official who had retired in 2001. He had lived, at the time of the slab pour, less than a mile from the Carver home. Whether he had walked that foundation bed before signing the certificate, whether the signature was negligence or complicity, was a question that investigators quietly pursued and quietly failed to answer. The man was elderly and in declining health. He denied everything. No charges were ever filed. In the spring of 2017, the official conclusion arrived. After months of forensic review and consultations with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the Harlow County Sheriff's Department issued its final determination. The deaths of Daniel Carver, Tommy Reyes, and Claire Anderson were ruled accidental but suspicious. The ruling described a scenario in which the three teenagers, after leaving the banquet hall on the night of May 16, 1992, had inadvertently driven down an unmarked service road adjacent to the Dry Creek construction zone. The road terminated at the edge of an open foundation pit. In the dark and without warning, the vehicle had rolled or driven into the pit, trapping the three inside. The following morning, or possibly days later, workers unaware of the vehicle's presence had poured the foundation above it. The report was careful and thorough and entirely unconvincing to anyone who had spent time with the evidence. The forensic inconsistencies had not disappeared because the report didn't mention them. The clean undercarriage, the neutral gear shift, the unbuckled belts, the absence of impact damage, the overnight unscheduled pour, the man who had failed a polygraph and then conveniently died before charges could be filed. None of it fit the word accidental in any way a reasonable person could accept without strain. The families listened to the ruling read aloud and said very little. Margaret Anderson did not attend the press briefing. She told a reporter afterward, in a sentence that circulated online for months, that accidents do not pour concrete over themselves. Daniel's brother sat in the back of the conference room in his uniform, his hands flat on his knees, and watched the sheriff read from a page. He did not speak to anyone after. Tommy's sister described later feeling as though someone had handed her a wrapped gift, and when she opened it, there was nothing inside. The official file was closed. That fall, Harlow County held a memorial service for the three. It was held at the high school auditorium, which had been cleared for the evening and decorated with the three restored senior portraits, each one enlarged and placed on a stand at the front of the stage. The lights were kept low. More people came than anyone had expected. Former classmates who had moved away years ago drove back from other states. Teachers who had taught them sat in the middle rows. People who had never known them personally but had grown up with their story in the background of their own childhoods came and sat quietly in the upper rows. The principal spoke about what it meant to lose someone young. The sheriff said the word closure with the careful neutrality of someone who knew it wasn't adequate. When Margaret Anderson stood at the podium, the auditorium went completely silent. She held a small plastic evidence bag in her hand. Inside it was a gold bracelet. She said the lab had returned it that week, sealed and labeled and cleaned of whatever the concrete had left on it. She said holding it felt different than she had expected. Not cold, not clinical, more like holding something that had been waiting. She said Claire had borrowed that bracelet from her own sister, who never asked for it back, because asking for it back would have meant accepting something that felt unacceptable. She said she believed what had happened to her daughter was not an accident in any meaningful sense of the word. She said she believed someone in that room, or someone connected to someone in that room, had spent 24 years knowing something they chose never to say. She thanked the people who had lit candles and stapled flyers and kept showing up to an anniversary that never got easier. She said she was going to keep showing up too. The following week, the three were buried in the cemetery at the edge of town, their caskets placed side by side beneath a sky that had gone the particular gray that Ohio skies go in October. The ceremony was quiet. The headstones were simple. After the official portion ended, people stayed longer than expected, moving slowly from stone to stone, running their fingers along the carved letters of names that had been printed on flyers and spoken aloud in churches for 25 years. That evening, the story ran nationally for the last time, at least for now. Newscasters called it a haunting resolution to one of Ohio's oldest cold cases. The phrasing was clean and distant in the way that professional language is when it is being applied to something that should not have a professional distance applied to it. For Harlow County, it was not a resolution. It was confirmation. There is a difference. Construction resumed at the Dry Creek site the following month. The pit where the car had been found was filled with fresh gravel, leveled by machine, and eventually paved over as part of the new facility's loading area. Workers on the crew during that phase later mentioned, in the way people mention things they don't fully understand, that the ground in that section always felt soft. Not dramatically, just slightly more giving than the rest of the lot. The way ground feels when it has been recently disturbed and hasn't entirely settled back into itself. The case file sits in the archive now, officially closed and practically open. The way cases stay open when the living still have questions the dead can't answer. Somewhere in the county records room, behind newer boxes and older ones, is a folder labeled with 3 names. The ink is original. The paper is beginning to yellow at the corners. The truth about what happened between the parking lot of the Crestwood Banquet Hall and the concrete floor of the Dry Creek industrial site on or around May 16, 1992, has never been stated plainly by anyone still alive. What is known as this? 3 teenagers left a prom with a full tank of gas and a mixtape and plans to watch the valley from an overlook. They did not arrive. Their car was found buried under a deliberate pour of concrete on industrial land, less than 2 miles from where they started. The man most likely to have arranged that burial died before he could be charged. The official investigation produced a ruling that satisfied the paperwork requirements of finality without satisfying any honest reading of the evidence. And so the last image anyone holds is the same one that started everything. 3 faces in school portraits, taken months before any of this happened, wearing the particular expression that people wear when the future is still something you get to imagine. Eyes open, smiling with no reason not to. Frozen at 17 and 18 years old, in a photograph taken in the gymnasium of a school they would never walk out of again, looking forward in a direction that never arrived. The roads in Harlow County have been repaved several times since 1992. New buildings stand where old ones fell. The people who were teenagers that night are in their 50s now, or gone. The parking lot where a silver Pontiac pulled out into the dark on a warm May evening has been a hardware store for 20 years. But the question Margaret Anderson asked from a podium in a dim auditorium has never been answered, not by a court, not by a file, not by anyone with the standing to make it matter. Accidents, she said, do not pour concrete. No one has ever explained why this one did.